Now, recently, the streets of Hull were transformed into the streets of Whitechapel, London, for an upcoming drama about Jack the Ripper. Now, I believe it stars Martin Clunes, and it's going to be something to do with one of the suspects being from the royal family. But I'm not here to talk about that. What I'm here to talk about is the fact that when I found out about this, my little brain started thinking, hey, is there a connection to Jack the Ripper and Hull? And I went down a bit of a rabbit hole, and it turns out that there is. When you think of Victorian England's most infamous unsolved murders, your mind probably wanders to the dark streets of Whitechapel, because it was there that in 1888 a series of brutal killings would grip not only London, but eventually the entire world. Whitechapel back then was one of the poorest districts in the capital. Overcrowded, crime-ridden and desperately impoverished, violence wasn't uncommon. Women living on the margins of society often turned to prostitution simply to survive, and murder, tragic as it sounds, wasn't unheard of. But these murders were different. The level of violence shocked even seasoned police officers. The victims had been mutilated in a way that suggested a killer acting with extraordinary brutality. And as the body count rose, so too did the fear. Today historians refer to 11 killings as the Whitechapel Murders, although only 5 are widely believed to have been the work of the same killer. Those women, Mary Ann Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Jane Kelly, would become forever known as the Canonical Five. The person responsible was never caught. Instead, they became known by a name that still sends a chill down the spine today, Jack the Ripper. As the mystery deepened, one unsettling question began to surface. If the killer could evade the police so easily, who was to say they would remain in Whitechapel? Could they simply leave London and strike somewhere else? For the people of Victorian Britain, that wasn't an abstract question. It was a very real fear. And in a busy port city like Hull, where ships arrived daily and strangers came and went with little more than clothes on their backs, it wasn't long before people began asking exactly the same question. Hello friends, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm Claire and this is the Wanderlust Way. So today we are going to be walking through Hull, in particular through the old town and some of the museum quarter. Now obviously I've just said we're going to be looking at the Jack the Ripper connection, which is quite interesting, I must say. But before I kick off, let me say a massive thank you to everybody that supports the channel by liking, watching, commenting, subscribing, becoming a member, sending donations, sending super thanks, because honestly everything that you're doing is helping the channel to grow, and it's allowing me to carry on with adventures like this, sharing the stories that I find with you. And if you are a first time watcher, please do subscribe, because we go to lots of places and I try and find lots of interesting stories along the way. Anyway, that is enough waffle, let's wander. To understand the type of world that these Jack the Ripper murders were being committed, we have to step back into 1888. Now, of course, like I've just said, London is about 200 miles away from this place. So it's important to find out what Hull looked like in 1888. Now, it was a port town, it still is a port town or city, and it was very, very busy. Lots of people coming from Europe, from the Americas, from all over the place, and travelling through this part of the world. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go and have a look inside the Street Life Museum, because they've got some fabulous exhibits that are going to really show us what life was like then. In 1888, Hull was one of Britain's great maritime cities. Its docks were booming, warehouses lined the waterfront, and ships arrived daily carrying everything from timber and grain to fish and coal. Thanks to an expanding railway network, goods could be unloaded here and transported to every corner of the country, making Hull one of the busiest trading ports in Britain. The streets reflected that prosperity. Merchants, dock labourers, sailors and railway workers all played their part in a city that rarely seemed to stand still. Horse-drawn carts rumbled over the cobbles. Bicycles were becoming an increasingly familiar sight, while elegant carriages carried those wealthy enough to afford them. But Victorian Hull had another side too. Beside the impressive civic buildings and thriving businesses were overcrowded courts and narrow streets where entire families often lived crammed into a single room. Many homes had no running water, sanitation was poor, disease spread easily, and life expectancy was little more than 50 years. Work at the docks was often casual and unpredictable, meaning that one day a man might have wages in his pocket, and the next, nothing at all. For those with nowhere else to turn, the workhouse also offered little comfort, while some women found themselves forced into prostitution simply to survive. This carriage that's in front of us now, it's called, well, the sign says here, 1880. So this would have been around in the time that we are discussing. It says I don't know if that's Brougham or Brougham, please correct me if I'm wrong. It was named after Lord Brougham, who is credited with its design as a practical town coach. Oh, here we go.
I can see that you are a man who knows a fine carriage when he sees one. Yes. And for broughams, there are none finer than those of Messrs. Barker and Company. Yes, Snaresby. And my keen eye has not missed the poor quality of workmanship on their transom.
Whether you were travelling in the comfort of a carriage or walking the streets in search of your next meal, everyone shared the same city. The public houses were full of dockers and sailors swapping stories from distant ports. Beggars called from the roadside. Traders competed for business, and police patrolled streets where drunkenness, theft and violence were an everyday part of life. Hull Fair itself had gained a reputation for pickpockets, disorder and dubious entertainments, while the city's courts regularly dealt with assaults, domestic violence and crimes committed around the docks. It was noisy, it was busy, it was prosperous, but beneath the surface, life could be incredibly hard. Now this is a hearse from 1880 to 1900, so this would have been in Hull at that sort of time. It was drawn by a single lead horse or pulled by bearers. It was made by Gilchrist of Lancaster with the hubs and undercarriage built by J.J. Dobbs & Co. Death was never far away in Victorian Britain, and funeral processions would have been a familiar sight on the streets of Hull. Disease, industrial accidents and violence claimed lives with a regularity that feels almost unimaginable today. This was a city full of contrasts, wealth and poverty, opportunity and hardship, bustling commerce alongside desperate deprivation. And it was into this world that news of a mysterious killer stalking the streets of Whitechapel would begin to arrive.
Now, we all know that news travels fast, but gossip can travel even faster, and especially in a busy town or city like Hull, the talk of the town would be all about these murders, especially when the newspapers started getting hold of the story and they started running with any angle that they could find. So it wasn't just in London. The Hull newspapers were reporting these murders, and everybody wanted to hear about it, everybody wanted to read about it.
News of the Whitechapel murders wasn't confined to the streets of London. Every day, newspapers carried the latest developments across the country, arriving in towns and cities like Hull by rail before making their way into homes, workshops, factories and public houses. Dock workers discussed the latest reports as ships were unloaded. Travellers carried stories between railway stations, and by evening, conversations spilled into taverns, markets and churchyards. Wherever people gathered, there was one question on most people's mind. Had Jack the Ripper finally been caught? Now, I've managed to find an article from the Hull Daily Mail, which was published on Friday the 9th of November 1888. The body of Mary Jane Kelly had only just been discovered. Now, watching this today, we know she would become the final victim amongst those canonical 5. But the people reading this newspaper had no way of knowing that. As far as they were concerned, the killer was still at large. So let's step back to that morning and read exactly what they were reading. Special edition, another outrage in Whitechapel. Murder of a woman. The body found in an empty house. The victim disembowelled. Ears and nose cut off. Excitement in the streets. Employment of bloodhounds. That was the title. It went on to say, the Press Association says at 10:30 this morning, the dead body of a woman, with her head almost severed from her body, was found in an untenanted outhouse or shed in Dorset Court, Dorset Street, Commercial Street, Spitalfields. It later says, it is remarkable that Dorset Court is exactly opposite the house in Dorset Street, in which the unfortunate woman, Annie Chapman, used to lodge. The discovery created the greatest excitement in the neighbourhood, and crowds quickly gathered at the scene. The murdered woman was about 21 years of age, and the neighbours say that she was of genteel appearance, but they do not know her name or anything about her, except that recently she lived with a man whom she is now separated. This man was sent for at once and identified the body. Lewis, a tailor, states that he was playing pitch and toss in the court at 9 o'clock this morning, and an hour before that he had seen the woman leave the house and return with some milk. It is confidently stated the deceased was seen after 10 o'clock this morning in company with a paramour, while they were both drinking at a public house at the corner of Dorset Street. Her name is Mary Jane Kelly. The man she lived with sells oranges in the streets. After speaking to her in the public house, he left there to sell his oranges, and he states that he did not see her again until her corpse was discovered. Now this bit is interesting because it gives us an insight into a possible witness. The heading in the paper says, "The murderer spoke with ... and the article goes on to say, a young woman who sells roasted chestnuts at the corner near the scene of the murder has told the Press Association reporter that about 12 o'clock a gentlemanly dressed man came up and asked if she had heard of the murder. She said she had, and the man grinned and said, I know more about it than you. He then stared and walked off. He wore a black coat, black silk hat and speckled trousers and carried a black bag. The woman further states that the same man accosted 3 young unfortunates in Dorset Street on Thursday night, and they chased him and asked him what he had in the bag, and said, something the ladies don't like.
On the 5th of October 1888, a rather unsettling letter arrived at the Hull news desk. Now it was sent anonymously, somebody dropped it off. They never saw who the sender was, but it claimed to be from Jack the Ripper. Now what's ironic about this, or what's unusual about this, is this happened about a week before the famous From Hell letter, the one that was sent to London, the one with the half a human kidney in it, was received. So it just goes to show, but by the autumn of 1888, the hysteria surrounding Jack the Ripper and the hoaxes had already started here in Hull.
As the Whitechapel murders continued to dominate the headlines, fear and speculation spread far beyond London's East End. Whilst researching this episode, I came across an article by Hull historian Mike Covell on the Spooky Isles website. In it, he reproduces a report that appeared in the Hull News on Saturday the 13th of October 1888. Now, I wasn't able to locate the original newspaper myself, so I'm relying on that contemporary report as reproduced in his article. Now, according to the Hull News, just over a week earlier, on the 5th of October 1888, an anonymous letter had been delivered to the newspaper's offices claiming to be from Jack the Ripper. The letter read, Hull, October 5th. I arrived in Hull last night from Manchester, and may as well inform you that I have a job or two to do here. London's got too hot for me. It's all that I want is blood, blood, blood. For why, you will know when I'm copped. I'll sharpen my knives and I'll take their lives, and enjoy myself till I stopped. The report concluded by noting that the letter had been written in pencil on a page torn from a pocketbook, with a drawing of a knife at the bottom, apparently dripping with blood.
As the months passed, the fear of Jack the Ripper spread across Britain. It did spread across Hull too. Now, at this point, it didn't matter or not whether the killer was here, because crimes were being committed. People had got that idea in their head that Jack the Ripper could be prowling the streets, and it's really interesting to look at what was going on at that time because of this spreading fear.
I think most people would agree that the anonymous letter was nothing more than a cruel hoax. During the Whitechapel murders, newspapers and police received hundreds of letters claiming to be from Jack the Ripper, many of which are now believed to have been the work of attention seekers. But whether those letters were genuine or not, it's almost beside the point. They show just how deeply the Whitechapel murders had gripped the public imagination. The name Jack the Ripper was no longer just associated with an unknown killer in London. It had become a threat, a comparison, almost a byword for extreme violence. And that can be seen in newspaper reports from Hull over the years that followed. One of the earliest examples came in June 1889, less than a year after the Autumn of Terror. A labourer named William Jackson attacked a woman called Mary Ann Fairley after dragging her into a passage off King Edward Street. During this assault, he reportedly threatened to Jack the Ripper her before stabbing her 3 times. The attack shocked local residents and, according to newspaper reports, the area briefly became known as Ripper Street. Then, nearly a decade later, in 1898, another shocking crime made headlines. George Stoner took Emily Hall to a common lodging house on Dock Street before leaving shortly afterwards. When the landlady went upstairs to check on her, she discovered Emily suffering from horrific injuries and losing a great deal of blood. Now, despite being taken to Hull Royal Infirmary, she later died from severe internal bleeding. Stoner was convicted of her murder and originally sentenced to death, although this was later commuted to life imprisonment. Several newspapers of the day dubbed him Hull's Jack the Ripper, despite there being no connection whatsoever to the Whitechapel murders. And the comparisons didn't end there. In November 1900, panic spread once again after 5 women were stabbed along Beverley Road in a single evening. The man responsible was 23-year-old James Gray. He had previously carried out similar attacks on 7 women in Doncaster. Now, although his victims survived, newspapers were quick to draw the comparison again with Jack the Ripper. Gray was eventually sentenced to 12 months hard labour in January 1901. So even the name itself was being used to terrify people. One report tells of a drunken local man, Samuel, or Sam, Nob, repeatedly shouting, "I am Jack the Ripper," as he frightened women in Adelaide Street. So looking back, it becomes clear that Jack the Ripper was no longer simply the name of an unidentified murderer. It had become part of Britain's vocabulary, a symbol of fear that lingered long after the streets of Whitechapel had fallen silent.
I've now got to take off my sort of modern mind, and I'm going to invite you to do the same, because we've got to look at this from a completely different point of view. Now, back then, port towns and port cities like Hull, it would have been incredibly difficult for the police to track people. You have got thousands of people moving through places like this on a daily basis from all over the place. They've got no passports, bear in mind. There's no CCTV. There's no way of really tracking them, recording them, finding out where they've come from, where they're going. And that made it very easy for somebody that was a little bit dodgy, shall we say, to arrive somewhere like this, stay in a cheap lodging house, get a few days work, maybe commit a few crimes, and then just disappear without even getting caught. And I think that's why probably sort of hysteria around certain crimes, especially sort of serial killing crimes, would have been quite frightening in a place like this, because you are literally coming across strangers on a daily basis.
Standing here today, it's peaceful. But in 1888, the waterfront of Hull would have been alive. From first light until long after dark, the area around here would have echoed with the sound of steam whistles, horses' hooves striking the cobbles, and dock workers shouting to one another as ships were loaded and unloaded. Timber from Scandinavia, grain from the Baltic, fish from the North Sea, and cargo from across Europe all passed through these quays, making Hull one of Britain's busiest ports. The air would have smelt of coal smoke, salt water, tar, wet timber, and the catch of the day. Sailors spilled from ships into nearby public houses, merchants hurried between offices, railway wagons waited to carry goods inland, and cranes swung endlessly above the docks as another vessel prepared to leave and another edged slowly into the harbour. Hull was never still. It was a city built on movement. People arrived, people departed. New faces appeared every single day, while others quietly disappeared into the crowds just as quickly. It's hardly surprising that when stories of an elusive killer dominated the newspapers, some people began to wonder whether somewhere like Hull could ever truly know who was passing through its streets.
It says on here this statue is located on the reclaimed land at the Bullnose, where ships waited for high tide before entering Humber Dock. Neil Hadlock's sculpture depicts a family from Northern Europe having left ship before continuing to Paragon Station, then on by train to Liverpool, then by ship to America. Look at that. Over 2,200,000 people passed through Hull and other Humber ports to America between 1836 and 1914.
For many of the people who passed through Hull, this wasn't simply another stop on a journey. It was the beginning of an entirely new life. Families fleeing poverty, persecution and political unrest in parts of Eastern Europe, they arrived here carrying little more than a few possessions they could fit into a trunk or suitcase. Many had never seen the sea before. After arriving in Hull, they were given food, medical examinations, and in many cases train tickets across the country before boarding another ship bound for America in search of opportunity. For some, Hull was a place of hope. For others, it was simply somewhere they passed through before disappearing over the horizon. Every one of them had a story. Every one of them was a stranger to somebody.
Now this sign says the timber, I'm guessing that says boogie from the Hull docks, which is this. It says this is the last remaining of hundreds that were used to transport timber around Hull docks. They were used from the 1870s onwards for almost 100 years. This was mostly at Victoria Dock, the centre of Hull's timber trade. They were shunted about with small locomotives and later road tractors. Each boogie could carry 7 tons of timber.
The docks, as we've learnt, were the lifeblood of Hull. They brought wealth, opportunity and new beginnings, but they also brought danger. Heavy machinery, industrial accidents, drunken brawls, theft and violence, they were all part of life along the waterfront. Day and night, cranes creaked overhead, horses hauled heavy loads through the streets, and ships arrived and departed with the tides, carrying cargo from across Britain and Europe. After dark, however, the atmosphere changed. Gas lamps cast long shadows across the cobbles, the glow from public houses spilled onto the streets, and mist drifted in from the Humber, softening the outlines of ships moored against the quays. Even though the docks never truly slept, the darkness transformed them into a place of deep shadows and hidden corners where familiar faces mixed with complete strangers. Most of the people passing through these docks were honest, hard-working men, women and children simply trying to earn a living or build a better future. But history has taught us that, amongst ordinary people, extraordinary evil can sometimes pass completely unnoticed.
If there's one thing I think everybody can agree on when it comes to Jack the Ripper, is that nobody can agree on who they think the suspect is, or who the main suspect is, who's most likely to have committed those murders. And what's interesting is that people have studied this for years. You've got ripperologists, they're so called, that study it all the time. Then there's historians, there's writers, and yeah, there's lots of facts. Even to this day, there's people are still digging stuff up. Now, what's interesting and what's relevant to this video is that there was actually a chap who was born in Hull who was one of the main suspects at one point. His links to the occult in particular made him very, very suspicious.
Robert Donstan Stevenson was born in Hull on the 20th of April 1841. But if you're hoping for an ordinary Victorian gentleman, think again. Depending on which account you read, Stevenson had studied medicine in Paris, chemistry in Munich, travelled across Europe, served with Garibaldi's army in Italy, panned for gold in America, and even searched for magic in India. He was a journalist, a writer, and a man with an intense fascination for the occult. The trouble is, separating fact from fiction isn't always easy. Stevenson had a reputation for embellishing his own life story, and even historians disagree over just how much of it was true. What we do know is that by the summer of 1888, this Hull lad was staying at the London Hospital in Whitechapel, having been admitted on the 26th of July. That hospital stood only around 150 yards from where Mary Ann Nichols, the first of the canonical five, was discovered on the 31st of August. He remained there throughout the period of the murders, finally leaving in December, just after they ended. Now, as you can imagine, the murders dominated conversation inside the hospital just as they did everywhere else. But Stevenson didn't just follow the investigation. He immersed himself in it. One day he watched a doctor demonstrate how the killer may have overpowered and murdered his victims. Rather than being impressed, Stevenson became suspicious of the doctor himself. He shared his concerns with a man called George Marsh, an ironmonger salesman who fancied himself something of an amateur detective. But Marsh received a very different conclusion. It wasn't the doctor who worried him. It was Stevenson. Marsh went straight to Scotland Yard and reported Stevenson as a possible Jack the Ripper suspect. When Inspector Roots interviewed him, he already knew exactly who Stevenson was, describing him as a travelled man of education and ability, a doctor of medicine, a major from the Italian army, and a newspaper writer. Despite the allegations, no evidence was found linking him to the murders, and the investigation appears to have gone no further. And you'd think that would be the end of the story, but it wasn't. Because rather than distracting himself from the case, Stevenson threw himself even deeper into it. On the 1st of December 1888, he published a lengthy article in the Pall Mall Gazette, claiming he believed he had solved the mystery. His theory wasn't that the killer was driven by revenge, or madness, or hatred of women. Stevenson believed the murders were part of a series of black magic rituals. He argued that organs removed from the victims' bodies were not taken at random, but for use in occult ceremonies. He even analysed the infamous graffiti said to have been left by the killer, claiming the unusual spelling of the word Jews pointed not towards England, but towards a French-speaking murderer. Then came perhaps the strangest claim of all. Stevenson believed that if you plotted the murder sites on a map of Whitechapel, they formed the shape of a cross. He suggested this wasn't coincidence at all, but a deliberate act of ritual symbolism intended to profane Christianity through murder. To modern ears, it sounds extraordinary, but to some people at the time, it sounded like a man who knew an uncomfortable amount about the crimes. Over the years, that suspicion only grew. Writers such as Melvin Harris became convinced Stevenson was the killer, describing him as the only suspect who truly matched the opportunity, personality and knowledge required to commit these murders. Other researchers pointed to his medical interests, his obsession with the occult, his proximity to the crime scenes, and his eagerness to involve himself in the investigation as reasons to take him seriously. But every mystery has another side. Modern researchers have challenged many of the claims made against Stevenson. Hospital records suggest that patients in that ward where he was staying were not free to come and go during the night. Later studies of staffing routines concluded that leaving unnoticed at the exact times of the murders would have been extremely difficult, if not impossible. Other aspects of his story, his travels, his military career, and some of his more dramatic claims may have been exaggerated by Stevenson himself, suggesting he was in fact a fantasist. So where does that leave us? Was Robert Donstan Stevenson a brilliant but eccentric writer who became completely consumed by the greatest murder mystery of the Victorian age? Was he simply an attention seeker who inserted himself into the investigation? Or was there something more sinister hiding beneath the surface? More than a century later, historians and ripperologists are still arguing over exactly the same questions. And perhaps that's why I found his story so fascinating. Because whether he was innocent or guilty, one of the most controversial suspects ever put forward in the Jack the Ripper case began life not in Whitechapel, but here, in Hull.
So it's been almost 140 years since those Whitechapel murders, the Jack the Ripper killings, and yet we've still not got an answer as to who did it. But it's still one of those mysteries that is still fascinating people. People are still talking about it, they're still making books about it, writing scripts for movies and filming movies. Obviously there's that new one coming up very, very soon, which I am looking forward to seeing. But I just wonder, why is this? Why are we so fascinated? Why do we need to know who the killer or killers were? And let me know if this is a subject that you've been looking into for some time or come across before. Who do you think Jack the Ripper was?
So much time has passed since the Whitechapel murders. The gas lamps have long since disappeared. The Victorian slums have been swept away, and the streets where those terrible crimes took place have changed beyond recognition. Yet somehow, the mystery refuses to die. Every few years, another book promises to finally unmask Jack the Ripper. A new documentary appears. Another suspect is put on trial in the court of public opinion. Films, television dramas, and walking tours continue to draw people into a story that has fascinated generation after generation. Even now, as we've seen recently here in Hollywood, cameras have once again rolled through the cobble streets, bringing the story back to life for our entertainment. But why are we still so fascinated? Perhaps it's because we'll never know who the killer, or killers, really were. Perhaps it's because every generation believes it might finally be the one to solve the greatest unsolved murder mystery in British history. Or perhaps it's something much simpler than that. Maybe the story was never really just about Jack the Ripper. It was about the people who lived through it, the fear that spread through ordinary communities, the rumours, the speculation, and the way one unidentified killer came to cast a shadow over an entire nation. As we've discovered today, that shadow reached far beyond the streets of Whitechapel. It reached newspapers, dockyards, and public houses. It inspired hoaxes, fueled suspicion, and even cast doubt on a man born right here in Hull. Because that's the real reason the mystery still endures. Because long after the murders came to an end, the story never really did.
So that's it. Thank you to everybody for watching the video. Do let me know what you think about the Jack the Ripper story. Let me know what your thoughts are, because I know a lot of you have already mentioned to me before in previous videos who you think Jack the Ripper was. And if you're from Hull, Big up to your city. Thank you for welcoming me in. Now, next episode, we are in Horncastle in Lincolnshire. And this is a bit of a clue as to why we are here. So Horncastle was the home of William Marwood. William Marwood was the Victorian executioner in Victorian Britain. Now they've currently got an exhibition going on in Horncastle, and funnily enough, I'm in the exhibition, only a tiny little bit. So I'm coming down to have a look, but I'm also going to walk through the footsteps of Britain's one of the most famous executioners, and learn a little bit more about how an ordinary shoemaker can become a hangman. So until next week, stay safe, stay curious, and don't have nightmares.